go. So by the miracle of technology, this is a LinkedIn Live, something we're trying new, hopefully working, and hopefully a number of people will join and have a look at what we're going to talk about. Lucky enough to have joining us a couple of real experts in the field to talk about the impact of the UK election and really what we could expect to see after what was, I think, quite a by any stretch, a landslide. So we've got Simon Bloch from JMW and Matt from Sonovate. So Simon, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Simon Bloch. I'm a partner and joint head of the employment team at JMW's Manchester office. We are experts in the recruitment sector in terms of advising employment businesses and contracting businesses alike. So it will be good to talk about what's happened in relation to employment law in the following the election.
Fantastic. I'm just going to check. I think I'll just check with our team that we're live on LinkedIn as well. Matt, why don't you introduce yourself?
Cheers, Andy. Yeah, so Matt Coburn. I'm the head of customer success and partnerships at Sonovate. Sonovate are the funder to the recruitment industry in the UK, funding everyone from startups through to large enterprise businesses through a range of products. Really excited to be here today. I'm looking forward to having this conversation. I think it's going to be an interesting few months ahead.
So, Simon, Labour were quite clear around what it is they were going to do. So they were quite precise and quite, I think, accurate in their manifesto about a number of things. So what sort of highlights could we expect to see?
Yeah, so let me just give some background into this. So as the typical Labour Party pro-worker rhetoric goes, what the party did was that they initially published a green paper called A New Deal for Working People. And the initial new green paper deal was, in effect, it wasn't really for businesses. And the stance that Labour had taken on its employment proposals was quite firm and inflexible, with absolute positions that they'd said is that they would create a single status of worker, that they would give workers all day one rights on the job, and that they would ban 0 hours contracts and outlaw fire and hire practices and fire and rehire practices. And the proposals weren't particularly well received at the very beginning in terms of their green paper, because businesses were rightly concerned and unlikely to have voted for Labour because they prefer a bit more flexibility. And that backlash prompted Labour to amend their manifesto for employment issues. And on the 24th of May, the Labour Party published their final 24-page document, which was entitled The Plan to Make Work Pay, which was delivering a new deal for working people, which promised to bring in a new partnership with businesses and trade unions rather than a division and decline, and saying that they will work with employers and workers to get Britain moving again, and has some degree of flexibility built into it. And the things that they've listed, and this is not everything, these are the main topics that we've pulled out, which we think are the most important that they've addressed, is firstly the removal of 0 hours contracts and one-sided flexibility. So there is a commitment in there to do that, that they will stop fire and rehire practices. There will be some basic one-day rights that are created for workers and employees. There will be some change to the single status of worker, some more family-friendly rights, further flexible working rights, the right to turn off from work. That will be interesting to see how happens with that. They've also introduced something about the genuine living wage, and they've said that they want to update some of the trade union legislation. So what they've said in their new deal is that they will introduce legislation in Parliament that comes about within 100 days of entering government. So we're already a few days in, so they've got less than 100 days already now. And that, subject to consultations and other government and parliamentary priorities, that date effectively takes us to somewhere in the middle of October. So we can expect that within 100 days there will be some type of legislation that is going to come into effect. And that doesn't mean that they're going to pass the legislation within 100 days, or that we'll have a change in the law by mid-October. Just means that we're going to have a bill that will have to be debated by the House of Commons and the House of Lords within that time frame. My view is I don't think you're going to see legislation come about overnight. It's going to take a bit of time to get it right after you look into consultations. And so we can expect, I expect, legislation by sometime in mid-2025.
So I guess the obvious question on that is the thing that really stands out, right? So a lot of our audience, recruitment agencies, running contract businesses, temp businesses, day one rights for all workers.
So what they've said in relation to day one rights is as follows. Just bear with me. Just get my... Yeah, so currently, employees generally are required to meet a qualifying period of 2 years service before they can, for example, bring a claim of unfair dismissal. So that's for employees. Of course, there are other rights such as discrimination or wrongful dismissal, which are already day one rights, but the Labour Party has said it believes that day one rights can go further to protect workers and employees. So the new day one rights could be the right not to be unfairly dismissed, and that could extend, based on what we've seen, to workers, which would mean that recruitment companies could be on the hook for that. We'll have to see what the detail says, but if they want to provide those additional rights to workers, then that's certainly something that could be on the horizon. But also the right to receive parental leave and pay, the right to receive sick pay. So what the New Deal has said is that introducing day one rights won't prevent dismissals for the current set out reasons that are already provided for in legislation. But there are a number of proposals within the previous Green Paper that the New Deal doesn't address, such as removing the statutory cap on compensation for unfair dismissal, which would make dismissals very expensive. But we have to expect that there will be day one rights which enhance these laws. So employers will need to fundamentally rethink their approach to dismissals, especially where they're looking to let go of workers, as every one of those workers will need to go through a potential full and fair process for individual dismissals or risk potential claims. So I think there's going to have to be a bit more caution out there during the hiring process, putting in place more rigorous recruitment processes, which could potentially stagnate the market. There will be a greater focus on robust and carefully managed dismissal processes that will need to be implemented. So I think the New Deal attempts to appease employers wanting to retain a degree of flexibility in respect of new hires, because they will want to ensure that built into their processes is built-in probationary periods, which will mean that as long as you've got a probationary period in place, there may be an ability to have a fair and transparent process. So I think that's the way that we're going to see things pan out in relation to these day one rights.
Matt, you've obviously got a helicopter view of the market, funding $5 billion today. You're going to have a lot of insight into the trends over the last couple of months. What's your feeling around the impact that the election will have, and potentially as well interest rates starting to come down at the end of the year on the contract market?
So thanks for that. I think this year, not just the last couple of months, has been a really interesting one, right? So having an election in 2024 was the worst kept secret in the country. The fact that it was in July was probably a bit of a surprise. all told, it's like the country, and especially in the staffing market, has had a collective holding of breath. People have been waiting to make decisions. You can see that across a range of reports that we've probably all seen over recent months, where kind of temp staffing numbers have been static or slightly down. Confidence has been near or at kind of zero. And I know I saw a report that came out this morning that showed that for the first time, the confidence levels for hiring decisions had nudged past zero into positive territory for the first time since November last year. So, these are the types of things that have kind of been dogging the marketplace. I think the biggest single thing impact that has been speed of decision making. So lots of people with lots of really, really good ideas, fantastic employers and staffing agencies out there with lots of opportunity, but then the people supplying those opportunities taking longer to decide on the number of candidates they want, the types of roles they're looking to fill, drilling down into the nuts and bolts on contracts to make sure they're completely watertight and not necessarily accepting things kind of as were. So lots of delays in the market there. I think what we probably will see over the coming months going into summer now. So again, it's not the speediest time to get things done. So similar to what Simon said, I don't think you're going to see huge immediate impacts in the sector. I think a few things will start to come through where people get more confidence and stuff like that. But come September time, I think where you'll start to see changes in the kind of volumes of placements, the temp staffing sector going up, kind of contracts being agreed, decisions being made, because there'll be more clarity on what the government's going to do. To the point that Simon made a minute ago, the first 100 days, they've promised a lot if you look at that manifesto, but there's not a lot of detail around that. So let's see what that looks like. When you're moving into the economic cycle, so you've seen inflation drop significantly over the last 6 months. Bank of England's done a good job on kind of managing that. And I say the Bank of England on purpose. I don't actually see what the government's done in there too much behind the scenes. But I think had it not been for the election, there was a strong possibility we would have already seen a base rate reduction in June. A lot of the commentary seemed to allude towards positive. That would have been a positive decision to make. We've seen a small rate decrease on the continent. In the States, it's slightly trickier. They've got different set of inflation figures and things influencing there. But I think, again, it's pretty well trailed from the Bank of England minutes from their last meeting. And when you look at the economic data with inflation and pay cycles and all the rest of it, that an interest rate drop kind of come August, September is on the cards. It's a strong possibility. You wouldn't say it's a certainty, you never can, but it's a strong possibility. And the government will definitely be looking for that positive news as well, because it'd be a nice kind of win to get. So I think you'll start to see all those factors build in towards the end of the summer, end of Q3, to more positive decisions being made, ideally more quickly, and with an economic outlook that's at least more detailed, if not necessarily more positive.
Okay. I certainly get the feeling it was a double whammy. You both had the election, and who'd have bet on it being called in July? Well, a few did, but so there was that, and I think though that's been quite priced in. I think it's the interest rates as well, and I think what will be very interesting to see as well as I think the new sort of spending, where the money comes from is a whole new story. We'll worry about that, I guess, another time. But the money being spent, I know there's a big push on housing. You'd imagine that budgets in the health service will be looked at again. Central, local government budgets. So, I mean, that might just see that stimulus in the economy.
So I think we were talking just very briefly before we came on, right, around where is the money going to come from, and that is the huge question. There's tight fiscal rules already been applied. So direct taxation ruled out most of it. There's a lot of areas they didn't rule out, but there's no data, no detail on that, and so it's really, really tough to speculate on those things. But they didn't make commitments around some of the taxes that the Tories did, right? So we've got to keep an eye out for that. And also, I think it really depends on a lot of things. So Simon was talking there about a lot of the employment ideas they want to bring in. Certainly throughout the course of the election, when you look at the notes in manifestos and stuff like that, some of that stuff is like they might want to talk about it in the first 100 days. They might bring legislation forward for mid-25, but some of it they were quite openly admitting it's probably a second term thing. So single status for workers, big ticket thing, might see some legislation about it, but then there's also quite a lot of commentary in the press towards the end of the election that might be a second term thing. So we just don't know. And when you factor in, you don't know what their priorities for spending are yet. It's very, very difficult to understand where you think any stimulus or otherwise will come from.
I think that's an important point, Matt. I think about the single status of worker. It's a great something that's been talked about for quite some time. And they believe that the current system that they've got, where you've got employee, worker, self-employed, it's a pretty complex landscape, and it leaves individuals without a clear picture of really where they sit and what protections they are owed, and businesses also struggle to actually place people into which category they actually fit. So understanding then the legal obligations. So it's probably something that is needed, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I think the other thing I've definitely thought about is you might bring all this legislation in. What happens to the many, many years of case law that we've got that address this issue of what somebody's status is? It's great to talk about having these protections, but I think we're going to have to see some more finer detail exactly how it's going to work, because there's years worth of law that's been made about statuses that they're going to have to contend with and think about before they bring this into effect.
Well, there's definitely the devil's going to be in the details. So, do day one rights, when do they apply from? If someone was hired last month, do they get day one rights from what point? Or is it only for new people, day one rights, and those people who've been serving for a month or two don't get them until their rights? Yeah. So it's all the idea of can it be retro is and I think they're very nice intentions, but as you say, Simon, I think the devil's definitely going to be in the detail.
Yeah. And I think we're heading towards what the New Deal does talk about in this single status of worker, is that we're just going to go have two statuses, which is worker and the genuine self-employed. So they'll effectively give all the rights to workers.
Yeah. We've got a question from Tim Jacob at Squadrato. I'll put this one to you, Simon. What do you think the impact of Labour's New Deal will actually be for the working people? We've done it through the lens of recruitment agencies and our businesses and our constituency, but will it actually make a difference to working people?
I actually do think it will, because I think lots of the rights that we've seen through the Conservative government so far have been all addressed at trying to prevent exploitation of the most vulnerable type of worker in society. I think if they get this right, I think what they're desperately trying to do, and under probably some pressure from the trade unions, is that they're going to allow the market, especially if you look at things like employment status and day one rights. Most people are very reticent to move around jobs because of the need to have, you don't get any protection until you've been in there for 2 years employment. If they're looking at giving protection from day one, if you leave a job and you think after a few months or say a year, it's not working out, you think to yourself, well, I better stay here for a little bit longer so I can get some protections. Because if I move somewhere else, I've got to build up all of those statutory protections again. Before I can have any rights. If I was to be made redundant, they may just decide to get rid of me. So we've got that. I think the other thing that we've got is that we've got this potential ban on 0 hours contracts. And I think that's definitely going to protect the worker, really, because we're going to end up in a situation whereby, this is my own theory, I've not seen anything written down like this, but you can potentially see us heading back to a situation whereby you've got a core set of hours like you did under the old Swedish derogation terms, perhaps. If you're going to be working on a 0 hours contract, there's got to be some guarantee of hours for the worker, or else there's going to have to be notices and penalties paid if you want to get out of those 0 hours contracts earlier. So I can definitely see, just through those two examples, that there's a lot of protections that are going to be built in, and it's not just for the most vulnerable. It will be for a lot of people who do want to work on 0 hours contracts and would like to move around jobs more often. The one thing I would say about the 0 hours contract piece is as follows: is lots of people like the flexibility that 0 hours contracts afford. It's not, you speak to a lot of people, and people who have 2-3 jobs, they like the ability to say, no, I don't want to work. Yes, I do want to work on really short notice because of the circumstances of my life dictating it. So there's going to have to be some thought built into the process about the fact that there are lots of people who opt for this type of structure to their working life.
Yeah, very much so. And we've got another question, actually. It was an area I was going to throw over to you as well, Matt. So one of the things I think, recruitment agencies always look at the worst and don't look at, but Tim Jacob again has asked, do you see the contract market going the way of the European Union and, the US? And I think what's interesting is, having worked in those territories, where there are those sort of rights, and actually everyone's a lot more scared of deemed employment and actually having, workers and employees on their books. I guess the question, does it go the other way? And, people want more self-employed workers for that flexibility, and they use agencies because they don't want to be taking the risk of, people straight off. And you see that in other territories. So with your sort of helicopter view on the globe, Matt, something you guys are pricing in?
Not right now. That is it's a huge question and a massively complex one, because there are really, really strong arguments on both sides. And I think Simon touched on part of it in his previous answer, in the fact that there's a huge amount of stored up kind of muscle memory around the way employment is done in the UK, which would be very, very difficult to unpick at a cultural level, not just a legal and financial one. So I think it's a really, really challenging one to answer. That's part of the reason. Again, it's not a safety blanket to hide behind. We just don't know what the Labour government are going to want to do and what their propositions are. Simon makes a good point there, and I was going to say it myself. Is there's a huge chunk of the UK marketplace that loves the gig economy. They love temp working. They like flexible working. It's in the millions of workers who love that status, right? But then equally, there are multiple millions of people that like the idea of stable employment, set contract, hours of working, and all of that good stuff. So how do you square that circle? That's the challenging bit. And so I would say that a lot of people would be advocating for that. You'd certainly see the similarities of it, and the flexibility of it for UK businesses and workers alike. But it's a huge and long-term and complex kind of puzzle to solve. And so whilst you might see some tinkering around the edges in the next few weeks, and then maybe some longer term legislation that looks to shape the market, I wouldn't say you're going to see us move that way quickly.
Guys, I'm going to throw this to both of you. If you're an agency owner now doing contract recruitment or permanent recruitment, what should you be saying to your customers about this subject? The EEA US bit, or no, just in general, what you would advise them to be doing.
From my point of view, I'm actually going to pinch some advice a customer I spoke to recently, where it's be very, very diligent and very, very good at what you do. He had 5 points. So you'll be very, very good and very, very knowledgeable at what you do. Be diligent in the contracts and everything that you're looking at. Maximum energy all the time. Communicate and diversify. So those were the things.
Yeah, go on. I'll have a go at that. So I think the one thing that it's important if you're going to be talking to your clients who may not necessarily be aware of all these changes or not got into the detail of it yet, I think the key thing now is to understand what your workforce is made up of. Be very clear who are genuinely self-employed workers and employees, and understand who could be impacted by the proposed reforms to the single status of worker. I think only when you've got that can help you better understand the cost implications in advance of those reforms coming about. I think the other thing I would encourage customers to do is, and this is for recruiters and for the clients, is check whether your policies and your legal documents are up to scratch, and understand the expectations, how it could work in things that could come about in relation to flexible working rights and the right to switch off. I'm not saying we've got all the detail yet, but you just need to start thinking about these things, because you're going to want to potentially plan once these 100 days have expired, and ensure that your HR and managers are up to speed on their training and employment processes.
We've got a comment from Neil Carberry, Chief Executive at Rec. My observation would be that Labour see the economic value of temp/contract work, but not why it matters to the workers themselves. The voice of contractors and temps will really matter to being persuasive. And I think there's a lot to be said. Definitely a lot to be said.
I would agree with Neil there. Yeah.
Last question I want to throw across to you guys is the one that's sort of, probably, is there as a bit of a footnote, but the right to switch off. Can you imagine these recruiters being told, no,
Yeah. Should I just throw in a couple of bits about that?
After 5:30, you've got to switch off.
I think what they've said is that we've got the longest hours culture in working in Europe.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I'm not sure. I don't know what to say in relation to that. But the proposals are intended to prevent workers from being contacted at all outside their working hours, which follows the similar types of models that operate in Belgium and Ireland, so I understand. And it intends to give workers and employers the opportunity to have constructive conversations and work together on bespoke policies or contractual terms that benefit both parties. So I don't think that we're going to find ourselves with the device having to automatically switch itself off, but I think we're going to have a dialogue on what is understood. Clearly, there are infrastructure systems that you couldn't face the gas or the water going off, and not being able to contact somebody outside their working hours to be able to sort these problems out. But I think there's basically, you're not just going to be able to contact people whenever you feel like it, as often is the case nowadays with the modern way of working. People send emails all times of day to suit their particular needs. But I think we're just going to have to find a way of working together to be able to stop people feeling the need to have to reply whenever they get a message, or not being away from their device at all.
If you don't mind, Simon, I think that's the key bit, right? It's around making sure that people don't feel the pressure to reply.
Yeah.
We're all of us, and I'm sure anyone kind of listening in would agree that there's times where it's really, really useful or urgent to get in touch with someone. But and also the way that different people work. Some people work really early, some people work really late. You're sending things out. Doesn't necessarily mean you need a reply. It's just you are doing your part of that action. And so it's one of those things you kind of got to look carefully at it, because if you're just automatically switching off devices, then where's the freedom of choice in that? I think if they're looking at that type of legislation, they would do well to look at making sure people's decision whether to reply or not is their decision, and they don't get penalized for it if they choose not to, rather than mandatory saying you cannot do this.
Yeah, and I don't think that probably. I think from things that I've heard about this is that it might be too nuanced for legislation, and it might come by way of some type of code of practice that will be taken into account by a court or by a tribunal if matters ended up there. But having this defined in legislation is going to be pretty difficult in my view.
Yeah,
it does look difficult. Gents, thanks so much for taking the time out. Some really insightful posts. I think it'll be interesting, I think, over the next 100 days, certainly how it plays out, and certainly by the end of the year. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to look back on this and see how it went. So, thank you very much.
No problem.
thanks.